All right. So welcome everyone to this session and webinar on this exciting topic of securing open source and the software supply chain. I've been lucky to be invited by ReversingLabs and Sasha here. We'll introduce ourselves in a little bit to discuss this topic and how it affects the cybersecurity posture and risks and the cybersecurity measures in organizations globally. In today's session, we will have a specific focus on the European Union. We are going to look at the NIS2 directive, Network and Information Security Directive 2, DORA, Digital Operational Resilience Act, and the Cyber Resilience Act. So those two together as a triangle is really then setting the requirements in the European Union also for software supply chain security and open source. And we will look more closely into that in today's session. But before we start, I would like to introduce myself and then pass the microphone over to Sasha. So my name is André Ornes. I'm the partner and for cybersecurity in White Label Consultancy. White Label Consultancy was established back in 2019 to work on leadership within data protection, and I joined the company in 2022 to drive sort of the services and development in cybersecurity, seeing that was in high demand. We work on security leadership from an executive perspective, and also then look extensively at the cybersecurity posture and how to really address that problem from a leadership perspective. I was the Global Chief Security Officer in a global mobile operator, Telenor Group, working across then 13 countries in the Nordics, Central Eastern Europe, and Asia. And drawing a lot of experience there, also within software supply chain security, for instance, the Log4j incident. And I have an extensive background within cybersecurity previously, also worked in digital forensics, which I find to be very related to the topic of software supply chain security when you get down to it. In today's session, then we'll have a close dialogue between the two of us. So let me introduce Sasha Stielar from ReversingLabs. And maybe Sasha, you can say a few words regarding ReversingLabs and yourselves.
Sure, happy to do that, and thank you so much, Andre, for the opportunity. So yeah, as said, my name is Sasha Stielar. I am the Chief Trust Officer at ReversingLabs. I'm also an operating partner in a private equity firm called Crosspoint Capital. I've spent about 20 years across energy and the technology sector in various cybersecurity roles, but also risk management, architecture, strategy, ERP systems, all kinds of kind of broad roles. But I would say I've grown up in cybersecurity as my primary focus. And that's where my career has been, focused at least the last, call it 16, 17 years or so. So I am thrilled that we're having this conversation. I think the time could never be better than right now to talk about some of the emerging threats around software supply chain security and open source, as well as commercial software can bring to an environment. Andre, you mentioned a number of key regulations that are driving some of this conversation. And, one of the interesting conversations I hope we get into is just how much of this in Europe happens maybe due to different drivers, like stronger regulation or compliance frameworks, versus in the US, there tend to be different sorts of drivers for this sort of thing. And it'd be interesting to kind of compare and contrast how the two different regions think about risk, the role of the CISO, some individual accountability. But I think that the core conversation is about how much of a risk software supply chain is, and frankly, how ReversingLabs could, help solve some of those problems for you in ways that almost nobody can. So we'll get into more of those details as the conversation goes on, but I'm thrilled to be here and looking forward to engaging in the conversation.
Excellent. Thanks, Sasha. Then let's move on to the introduction. So we all know in this forum that the cybersecurity threat landscape is it's rapidly evolving and becoming more and more complex as our dependency on digital services, cloud services, software as a service, open source, etc., becomes higher. Also then introducing AI, quantum computing, and crypto, etc. We also see then that with the threat landscape increasing in complexity, the level of vulnerability is also increasing. And we see that in particular on the software and digital infrastructure side, both in open source and in the commercial software. For open source, we've seen that that has been a major contribution to driving innovation of new technologies and really bringing new assets that everyone can use. But it contains hidden risks that is widespread and sort of unknowns in terms of security hygiene and the accountability and the transparency into who has contributed and what do the risks look like. Second, at the same time, we've seen that software supply chains have become an active target for sophisticated attacks, and attacks that can propagate through multiple layers and have unprecedented impact on businesses and the digital ecosystem. I mentioned Log4j. We've all lived through SolarWinds. In Norway, we had a large incident affecting the public sector with Mobile Iron 2 years ago, driven by most likely advanced persistent threats and targeted attacks. And we also had a year back the CrowdStrike incident that also had a huge impact related to security. So one of the questions that I really work a lot on is for top management and the boardroom, how do these threats and risks affect the resilience of the company, the regulatory compliance, and the trust, ultimately the trust in the brand? This is driving a new way of thinking and I think a much higher accountability in terms of ownership of not just your own business, but also the supply chain, the software and open source that you depend on. I really like to follow and use as an authoritative reference the World Economic Forum annual publications on global risks and also the cybersecurity outlook. This is a good global reference that really monitors the cybersecurity related risks and calibrates it against all other global risks. We see now that cybersecurity related risks are rated as a top risk both on the short term and the long term. And of course, one of the main drivers is the geopolitical tension. So that's conflict, war, and also interstate conflict at different levels. And cyber attacks, cyber operations, including state-sponsored espionage, sabotage, and intellectual theft is a key weapon in that arsenal, so to say. Second, it's the supply chain vulnerabilities, explicitly mentioned here as a major risk factor, and really seeing the huge dependencies that you have in the digital ecosystem, and of course, where software is, again, one of the major contributors. AI is, of course, introduced as a significant contributor to risk, both as it's leveraged by threat actors for reconnaissance, discovery of vulnerabilities, creation of malware, execution of attacks, fraud, misinformation, deepfakes, etc. So this is, of course, a rapidly developing risk, which is, of course, countered also by AI-enabled cybersecurity tools, which is then becoming a necessity to counter this risk. The final point, which is also something I see from the national security reports, for instance, in Norway, is the lack of preparedness. So the level of vulnerability is very high. The exposure to cyber attacks is uncomfortably high. and there is a lack of both organizational and technical readiness to meet the risks. This is of course then also affecting software security, and maybe even more there, inability to really look into your software supply chain to understand the vulnerabilities, the risks, and the dependencies, and what it means for the business's ability to operate. Sasha, maybe this is a point for you also to comment in light of this. How do you view that threat and risk landscape, and how is that driving sort of your vision from the ReversingLabs point of view?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I mean, look, if you look at the last 7, 8 years, maybe even longer, if we go back to, well, that's about, the right number. If we go back to maybe 2017, 2018, if we look at, WannaCry and NotPetya, if for those who remember that event, what may at this point maybe be lost on folks because it's been a little while is that was one of the first really global software supply chain attacks that we saw, right? People forget that was a specific kind of tax software called MEDOC that was Ukrainian tax software. At that time, the strong suspicion is that it was specifically targeting entities that were customers of that piece of software. But there's another very important, characteristic of that to remember, which is it was commercial software. It was commercial software. And if we look since then, for the 6, 7 years, 8 years that have transpired since, we have Circle CI, Kaseya, 3CX, SolarWinds, Ivanti, Okta, list goes on and on and on. And what do all of them have in common? They're all commercial software packages. So, one of the things that, we'll be discussing a lot of open source risk here, and absolutely open source continues to be a massive problem. And a tremendous amount of commercial software is based on open source software. But the minute you wrap a commercial compiler or packer around it, and it's something that you now acquire or purchase through a contract and use, the entire transparency around that or your ability to scrutinize is completely different, right? Generally, what you're left with is some sort of security questionnaires or some kind of security theater. You can't really have a technical control around it, or at least not without the right kind of tools like ReversingLabs. So to me, the part that stands out is just how much the landscape has changed over the 6 or 7 years, specifically targeting commercial software, because the bad guys know that's what we're all using. All of our companies run on commercial software packages. So that's kind of one big thematic that I pull out of that report. And we see a tremendous rise in the statistics around that. I think we'll even get into some of those later. The other big one is just how powerfully already AI is being leveraged for kind of weaponization, right? Whether it's for misinformation or disinformation, or whether it's to craft unbelievably sophisticated, business email compromise or phishing attacks. So imagine, Andre, right? So here we are doing this webinar. I'm sure it will be on all the socials. We'll do our best to make sure that it is. And 3 weeks from now, one of us or maybe one of our attendees, says, "Oh, I'll put it in your terms. Say, oh, Andre, I saw your webinar on, whatever it was, open source software with Sasha. Oh, looks like we both know him. He's a pretty good guy and, has some good jokes here and there." And whatever comes after that, has just established a level of trust that is far different than some sort of Nigerian uncle or Western Union scheme or whatever. So, the ability for AI at incredible scale to go out there and find meaningful context for crafting something as simple as business email compromise, not to mention, some of the other more advanced, attacks that are already happening, the ability to taint the seed data. ReversingLabs themselves has done some tremendous research into things like the Hugging Face library, which is, the root of a tremendous amount of machine learning and AI development out there. So the idea that the C data or the corpus data that the AI will be rooted in being also malformed or injected or tampered with in some manner is also not just a theoretical, it's a practical reality that we already see happening. So to me, those are the two big, the big highlights from the report.
Yeah, exactly. So thanks, Sasha. We all had our sleepless nights during WannaCry and NotPetya. So those are, I don't know if it's fond memories, but it's certainly strong memories. So just to look at maybe to structure a bit the risk that we are talking about for open source, we have the sort of common vulnerabilities in publicly available code modules that are leveraged across multiple packages. And as you mentioned, Sasha, that affects both open source and commercial software that depend on open source code. That brings a huge dependency risk, which is then incredibly hard to assess and understand from a company perspective as you consume hundreds or maybe thousands of software modules and components. And second, we have the potential for malicious code injection. And this is something that we have seen, sort of actively leveraging open source, injecting malicious code that's not detected. And then suddenly it's detected, reported, and then everyone has to scramble to remove it. And you don't really know necessarily what's happening in between. So that's a common attack vector that can have a huge footprint before you understand that it's there. And then finally, it's this lack of formal support. So when the sort of shit hits the fan, you don't necessarily know how the vulnerabilities will be closed. Security incidents will be responded to, and you don't necessarily have the formal support that you need in the timeline that it's required. So then you're dependent on sort of the open source community, best efforts, and security experts that can maybe come in and help you tactically resolve it for you. And then what you typically see is that there is this rush to publish patches, partially maybe addressing the vulnerability or risk, and then it's escalated and you get multiple patches. So that's quite an uncertain situation and hard to predict then how it's resolved. For software supply chain in general, you have this dependency vulnerability going back to both open source and commercial software. You have the potential for compromised software updates. So if the company's software is compromised or contains malicious code, you can automatically be compromised yourself through a regular patch, even if you have a high level of assurance in your own environment. So that is a sort of high uncertain risk. You have the third-party vendor risk and insider threats and sabotage. So there's a lot of sort of actors involved in software development, software engineering, the distribution of software, and the integrators. We'll get a bit into that shortly. And then there is a potential for any of those parties to introduce new threats, vulnerabilities, or risks in the software supply chain. So yeah, that's just to set the stage. I'd like to mention sort of one very interesting, very recent report from Verizon Business, the 2025 Data Breach Investigation Report, which we all read once it's published annually. So what we saw in this report is the number of reported data breaches is record high. I think that's an annual statement, Sasha, so that's nothing new, but very high and concerning numbers. Ransomware is a very significant contributor, but some of the interesting statistics we picked up out here. So 60% of the breaches involves a human element. So that is really driving home the need for a strong security culture, training and awareness, and really understanding the human's impact, the employee's impact on security. So that could be, of course, phishing, it could be misconfiguration, and so on. The second one here, 30% of breaches involved a third party. This is increased by 100% from 15% since last year's report. This is really then showing the dependency on the supply chain, including software. And it's showing that it has a real business impact in terms of data breaches. And then the final statistics, which sort of reflects back to World Economic Forum, 17% of the breaches are espionage motivated. So then nation state type APT attacks. The third party breaches is very much about or significantly about software security. So that's a main motivator. And this is really showing us that the security outcome or the ability to manage the security in software is becoming a critical issue for a business, both in the vendor selection, the vendor governance, and the follow-up. So it's driving, and this is an area that I've worked a lot on myself, sort of new needs for defining security requirements, doing the assurance, the due diligence, close evaluations, and also implementing an effective governance that's on security with both, strong relations with the vendor security staff and a close dialogue. Of course, this is a rapid change requiring new measures, and we discussed in the preparation for this webinar a good example from JP Morgan and Patrick Oppert, the CISO, sending out an open stern letter to suppliers targeting software as a service and the software supply chain, and really putting the risk out there and calling for a step up from the software industry. So this is very interesting to see. In my background as a mobile operator CISO, I have also had my history of writing these stern letters regarding products and security. It wasn't open letters, but really about putting the risk out there, stating the need to step up and a shared risk between the suppliers, the sort of other actors in the ecosystem, and the customer or consumer of the software. So this is a good example of a sort of open message and the need for stepping up as a community. So
just to add on that previous one, one of the reasons why I think this is, maybe a more profound moment in the industry than maybe most people realize is, the organizations like CISA in the US, we have CISA that as an organization that provides a lot of guidance. Europe has its own equivalents. Other jurisdictions around the world have their own. What's interesting about this is organizations like CISA and others, they can issue all of the guidance that they want, right? Whether it's secure by design, secure by demand, or whatever kind of the different flavors are. That means almost nothing to the vendor community, for whom this guidance is, they just see it as cost, right? If they're now told, boy, these are really things you should be doing. And by the way, while I'm a huge supporter of CISA and their mission, and I know many of the former directors and current folks very well, they're good friends. The mission is fantastic, and I would say directionally, no one could possibly argue with issuing very, very good, sound guidance. But if you look at what that guidance has been, it's basically been, hey, all that stuff we've been telling you that you should be doing for the last 15 years, you should really be doing all that stuff. Yeah. So it's things like, SAST and DAST and SCA and different kinds of AppSec related kind of traditional or legacy approaches, none of which would have prevented any of the software supply chain attacks, like I mentioned earlier, 3CX, SolarWinds, or any others. So, why is this moment important from Pat? I think it's meaningful because all of the leverage is with the buyers. Yeah. Right? There's no reason for a vendor to increase their cost, do more things, pay for more expensive tooling, have more people on the payroll, go through more processes, unless it's a cost they can pass on to the customer. And in most cases, you're not going to be able to do that. Or because the buyer, until everyone who is buying software starts demanding better, the behaviors are very unlikely to change because some guidance has been issued. So to me, the reason why this moment is very profound is, this is one of the world's largest companies, making it very clear to future vendors or who wants to do business with them, hey, we expect or these characteristics to be present in our software. So to me, this is why this is a profound moment. And I think we need much more of this. We need much more of the buyer side stating very clearly what their buying expectations are around the safety and security of the systems that they're acquiring.
I think it's an excellent point, and it sort of requires a move from the traditional buyer, with your change requests, and whenever you needed more security or wanted to address a risk, there would be a change order and additional costs related to that. So we can do as much security as you want. Here is the bill for it. So it's moving on from that to really setting the expectations. But also, I think, Sasha, then that necessitates a close collaboration between the customer and the supplier, because then you need to sit down and discuss the risks. What are they? What are the threats? And how do we address the vulnerabilities? So this is, I think, is a very interesting problem leading us to the ecosystem. So we put up, and we'll get back to this later as well, but we've sort of put up three parties in the ecosystem. It's the creators of software, the engineers and developers, and the software providers, either software as a service or software modules, open software, open source for that matter. And then you have the participants in the ecosystem, the integrators, maybe the resellers, that will use the software in a new context and deliver a more comprehensive service to the customers. And then you have the consumers of the software that could consume maybe hundreds or thousands of different software modules, and it's very hard to understand what the risks and vulnerabilities are. So together, this is the ecosystem. And maybe this is an area where you also could comment, Sasha, on how you work with these three parts of the triangle, so to say.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a kind of a framework we use to discuss this. We call it, build safe, buy safe, stay safe. And if you look at organizations like Gartner, I think they call it something like, curate, consume. There's some third word, but it's interesting that the whole industry is thinking about this in sort of a similar manner. Is what needs to be done from a software supply chain perspective for those that develop software, right? Software producers, those whose business it is selling software. Then there's those who consume other people's components, right? Whether it's proprietary components or whether it's open source components or commercial components, but what they're selling us or what we're using from them is essentially specific Lego pieces, right? We're using their specific Lego blocks as we are constructing, our software, whether it's internally for business purposes, purely internal purposes, or whether it's also for commercial purposes. And then the third pillar, and I would argue this is sort of the biggest tent, right? This is the one that we all belong in. While some of us produce software, all of us consume software. Mm-hmm. All of our companies in some way run on someone else's software, right? I doubt anyone on the call has written their own ERP, instead of using, SAP or something like that. I doubt anyone has written their own treasury management solution. I doubt anyone has written their own email, instead of using Microsoft or Google or whoever. So we all our businesses run on someone else's software, third-party software. So to me, this last pillar is sort of almost a meta umbrella, right? Yeah. This is the one that we're all in. And then some of us participate in different ways in these first two.
Exactly. So, so let's keep that in mind. We'll get a bit back to these three pillars or this triangle later as well. But I think it's now time to go a bit into the regulations. And then we take the Europe perspective, but also very interesting, Sasha, as you mentioned, to compare a bit to the US. What I put up here is a timeline for the last 10 years or so for Europe, UK, US, and Canada. This is not to exclude other regions. There is a lot of regulations coming and guidelines coming out in the Middle East, Asia, and across the world. But we limit the scope here to these regions. So what I want to focus on today is the NIS2 directive, Network and Information Security Directive 2, came out in 2023 and enforceable from the European Union as of October 2024. NIS2 is really impacting across all sectors, so it's really broad. So the nation states have really mobilized but struggled to meet the timeline. But we're seeing now in 2025 a big rush to get on board. Enforceable now in Finland, Denmark and Sweden is coming in the Nordics, and you will see most of the countries coming in place during 2025. My own country, Norway, is a bit delayed. We're outside the European Union, but part of the European Economic Area. So we expect to have it in place probably in 2026, but that still remains to be confirmed. Then we have DORA, the Digital Operational Resilience Act, affecting mainly finance and banking, enforceable from January 17 across the board in the EU. And implementing strict regulations and detailed ICT and security regulations for that sector. And then the Cyber Resilience Act, which was approved by the EU in 2022 and adopted in October 2024. And that's addressing this first part of the triangle, the producers or creators of software and digital products, and really putting the strong accountability on that part. Maybe, Sasha, you could mention for comparison some of the US regulations and guidelines as well.
Yeah, and many of them are kind of on the page here, right? NIST, you have I would say maybe the one that would bleed off the page a little bit here is the CISA 2015. And that is a profound kind of law in the US or bill that was passed, and it's actually now being discussed again. It's now been exactly 10 years. That's how long it was put in place. And what is CISA 2015? Well, to add a little bit of extra confusion, CISA 2015 has absolutely nothing to do with CISA, the organization as we know it today. It was an act that preceded CISA, the organization. In other words, before we had CISA, the organization, we had CISA, the act, which was the Information Sharing Act of 2015. And it's what permitted the first bits of, think about that now, 10 years ago, we had the first legislation that really provided some framework and structure for information sharing. If that is allowed to expire, and myself and a number of folks are doing quite a bit of advocacy on Capitol Hill in DC to ensure that we get a renewal of that act in the US, because it's critical for our ability to pick up the phone, call a colleague in maybe a peer company. So if you're in a telco, and something went wrong, it's your ability to pick up the phone and call your equivalent at the other company and say, hey, so what are you seeing? And is there anything that I can do to help? And here's some indicators of compromise, that we're using that you might find useful. Imagine not being able to do that again, as we weren't at one point, under kind of safe harbor, but now having to, spend 6 months aligning the framework for that discussion and each having to have a mountain of lawyers, to have that conversation. That would dramatically impact our ability to collaborate together. So that's one thing that this year right now in DC is being considered for renewal. Since then, of course, we've had a number of impactful things. Again, a lot of it for us is driven by CISA. But one thing I want to maybe highlight as an interesting contrast is if you look at how the two regions of the world even approach these sorts of regulations. So the US has had a tendency historically, and I wouldn't expect this to change anytime soon, but historically it has had more of a sort of business friendly or business first approach to regulation. So, maybe as an overarching, a goal for any bill is to ensure that it is not adversely impacting business, or at least a tremendous amount of consideration goes into how any decision made or any new regulation, how will that impact business? I think the European Union historically, and again, it's not something I expect to see change, has prioritized citizenry protection, I would say, above all other causes or all other goals or outcomes. So as a result of that, we've seen some evidence of that, right? When Europe was concerned about the privacy of its citizenry, we had a very, very, very heavy, GDPR that had, in some cases, a tremendous amount of business cost associated with it. But it was prioritized as something that the European Union or Europe in general, thought was important to prioritize for the protection of its citizenry. Since then, we've had a number of other examples, not necessarily cyber related, but clear examples of how the two regions, think very differently.
Yeah.
A good example was, a couple of years ago, EU was not thrilled about, the plug that goes on these phones, and had a very, very strong position on what that should look like. And again, it prioritized citizenry protection or what's good for its citizens above maybe what's good for business or things like that. And the reason I bring up that example is I think that carries through in some of the cybersecurity that we're seeing as well. I was just at a recent meetup of kind of private equity cyber executives, and there was a brilliant woman from Germany, and she got on stage and she said, hi everyone, I'm so and so. I come from Berlin, which is in the European Union. We like to think of ourselves as the Silicon Valley of regulation. She provided this thorough overview of all the, AI directives and all the other things happening. But I think that prioritization of citizenry protection, you see a lot of that in things like NIS2. You see it in the original ECRA, the European Cyber Resilience Act, right? You see it in DORA. You see it even in some of the lesser known ones where recently, I forgot the exact directive, but it was an update to a previous one where now software is being considered like any other product which has consumer protection laws. So now in Europe, you probably know, Andre, better than I do, the exact name of it, but it was a clarification that now says that software has to be warrantied for, I think, 10 or 15 years or something like that. And any open source component that is used within, for example, that piece of software is now, by using that piece of open source software, the vendor agrees to maintain and patch and make safe that software for, again, a period of 10 or 15 years. So
Exactly.
significantly more aggressive, or I would say more robust citizenry protection priority.
Exactly. So good, very good points. And I think to support that, we had the GDPR coming into effect back in 2018. And that was really the first strong cross-sector regulation that came into effect, affecting also information security, but it's about data protection. And for us information security professionals, it's always seemed a bit unbalanced that there haven't been similar provisions to protect, the security of the services and the security of the businesses. So I'm very interested to see how NIS2 in particular will play out, and will it be enforced with the same weight as GDPR? So that will be interesting to follow. But before we leave this slide, Sasha, I think one interesting contrast, and I often see this in discussions in Europe, is the position of in the US, the Security Exchange Committee, and their ability to really put accountability on executives and companies, and really exercising that enforcement power.
Yeah, it's a very important point. Now, I guess to be completely accurate, that applies to the Security and Exchange Commission. Its jurisdiction is generally speaking for publicly traded companies. Where there are so their remit is sort of the transparency and to ensure that there is sufficient information provided to potential investors. So the way that they've seen cybersecurity recently, I think it's 100% accurate, is, if you are an investor considering putting money in, pick your favorite Fortune 100, company traded on the, New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ or something like that. It has been the case for a long, long time that, material risks have had to be transparently exposed or provided to prospective investors so that you can make informed investing decisions, right? If there is a risk of patents of that business expiring, or competing in a certain region, or maybe the regulatory landscape will now make selling your product either costlier or more difficult. Anything that might be a material risk that an investor should be aware of has to be disclosed. And in the last few years, I would say rightly so, they've started considering cybersecurity risks as some of those risks that could materially impact an investor's decision making. Now, I think very few people would argue with sort of, as usual, the intent is good, right? Now, how that gets executed, is could be very complex. In other words, what level of transparency is sort of good enough without, frankly, providing a recipe for how to attack that company, right? Should a CISO write up all the vulnerabilities and risks that they have in their environment to achieve ultimate transparency and to inform the investor? Or might that act by itself actually bring a lot of risk to the corporation? So, threading that needle just right, or finding the right balance between what is enough to make an informed risk decision for an investor versus what is too much. I think that's where we've seen some of the lawsuits and some of the actions that have been taken. Very famously, there was what's called the Wells Notice, which is effectively like the SEC calling up or subpoenaing a CISO. We've seen that very famously happen to Tim Brown, who is the CISO of SolarWinds, and we've had other examples where the SEC has gone personally, against the CISO for something that they considered, gross negligence or acts of deliberate misleading of the investor.
Exactly. So very good. Then we've looked into a few of the regulations on both sides of the Atlantic, Sasha. And then I'd like to just go a little bit into, together we go into some of the European regulations. I will start with the NIS2 directive. The purpose of the NIS2 directive is to implement and achieve a harmonized high level of security across the European Union. It targets critical infrastructure and other important, it's called important and essential entities. And that is the scope, and it's quite wide. So it goes far beyond what's traditionally national security or critical infrastructure. So meaning, of course, that large segments of entire sectors will have to now mobilize because they're regulated for the first time. Very interestingly, you have the Article 20. That's a part of the obligations for the entities. And that states that there is a executive accountability. That means the board and top management. So it's really bringing that same accountability to the top executives of the entities or businesses. And it also places a responsibility for them to be trained, to be aware, and to understand what the responsibility is. And then we have two articles that really shapes the cybersecurity responsibility. The first one is Article 21. This is information security risk management practices. This is basically implementing a recognized standard or framework, such as ISO 27001, NIST cybersecurity framework, or NISA's frameworks, or national frameworks, and then implementing a set of prioritized security measures. Notably, you have C and D, so clauses C and D applying to the supply chain and to digital products. So then software security, open source security is explicitly there, meaning that you have to take that into consideration in your risk management practices. And then you have Article 23, and that's the incident reporting obligations. And that's actually stricter than GDPR in terms of the timeline. So within 24 hours, you have to report a incident to the authorities if it impacts your business. And that means that, of course, it includes your supply chain. So if you have a notification from one of your suppliers, software as a service or software supplier, Then you have 24 hours to turn around, do your legal assessments, your holding statements, the incident preparedness, starting your investigations, and then reporting to the authorities with all that in place. So that requires a much higher level of readiness to both assess, investigate, and respond to an incident and to report to the authorities. Then similarly, we have DORA affecting then finance and banking. I know, Sasha, you worked a lot on DORA in ReversingLabs. So maybe you can say some of sort of key observations related to DORA.
Sure. Yeah, and I'll just say, a quick little story. It was actually, geez, 3 years ago, something like that, that we started getting, the first phone calls at ReversingLabs from a good example was a company that developed a tremendous amount of software that was used by European banks. So they would develop, the key kind of either the mobile applications or the applications that, do some of the financial transacting or money movement behind the scenes. And they started contacting us when DORA, hardly had a name, when it was just being kind of discussed in some of the, hallways of Parliament and EU lawmakers, and said, there's this thing coming, or we believe that there's this thing coming, and we believe that it will have all of these implications for new, real technical controls that will be required, versus, again, what I've referred to before as kind of security theater, questionnaires and things like that. And so they said, we think that, you guys could, kind of be the answer to help us implement those controls. And at that time, we were hardly aware of it as well. And we said, well, go ahead, tell us, what are you thinking? How could we do this? Or how could we help you? And what's interesting is what they predicted at that time has sort of materialized into the final law. And I would agree how we can help other companies meet the challenge of DORA as well. So, for example, some of the more notable things around, Pillar 1, for example, of DORA talks about some of the, requirements around third-party risk and visibility. So, for example, whereas historically DORA has focused on things like the accuracy and financial reporting or financial stability and conduct, now there's this focus on transparency. For example, what is in the software that you're buying. So, while software bill of materials or whatever the phrasing might be, that might change over time. What they're really saying is, for both commercial and open source software, an organization has to be able to prove for its ICT third parties the level of transparency that gives them a feeling that they have a control for it, that they know what's in, that they can identify the attack surface, they can understand the dependencies, which is a critical component of the ICT risk management framework. It also stresses something that I think is, very, very important, which is a holistic approach to risk. One of the things that we frequently maybe over rotate on a little bit as an industry is, a lot of conversations tend, especially when it comes to open source, tends to race quickly to vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
And while vulnerabilities are very, very important, please don't think that Sasha's here saying that vulnerabilities don't matter. They're extremely important and they're a big problem. But, I would argue, and I think the holistic risk framework is pushing us in this direction, that there could be, and very often are, far greater risks to the software that you're acquiring than the vulnerabilities. If the vulnerability is really a flaw that could very well have been introduced inadvertently, right? A developer forgot to validate input and encode output, and now there's a cross-site scripting vulnerability. That may not have malicious intent, right? Meaning it may not have been deliberately done, and that may not actually even be exploitable. So vulnerabilities have this interesting nuance, right? But what if the software or the component, open source component, or the software you bought, what if it came with malware embedded, right? There is no debate around how bad that is, right? Or if it had been tampered with and there's a backdoor to it, right? There is no debate about what that means. What if there's an embedded private key or private certificate, or password embedded in the product? So embedded secrets. There's no debate about how bad that could be. So, I would just say that what DORA is pushing people towards is a more comprehensive, holistic approach to risk that goes beyond vulnerabilities. And that's another area where, ReversingLabs is very well positioned to help folks because the analysis includes things like, tampering and secrets and even cryptographic weaknesses, any hardening issues, things like that. So that's all kind of pillar one. Pillar four, I think, is another interesting one. That's where there's a strong emphasis on, again, managing risks associated with the third parties now, but in a slightly different way. So traditionally, the reliance has been on questionnaires. Now, what ReversingLabs provides the opportunity for a first real true technical control. So the ability to analyze commercial software and the ability to do what all those traditional tools cannot do, right? Whether it's SAS, DAST, or SCA, that is all useful when it's your code and you have access to it. What you buy from a vendor or from a third party in this case, you get something that's, setup.exe. You get a black box that you can't really see inside of, and none of the traditional tooling can help you do that. If you have a capability like ReversingLabs, which can take a fully compiled binary, absolutely nothing special needed. You don't need a special debugger version. You don't need access to source code, nothing. Just whatever you get from the vendor already is all you need. And now you could have a true technical control that can completely recursively unpack whatever that binary or ISO or container or image or whatever it is that you get from the vendor and tell you exactly what's in it. Not just a bill of materials to actually generate one, but if a vendor is providing a bill of materials, now you have a technical control to compare. You can generate your own and you can say, wait a minute, here's the one I generated. Here's the one that you provided. They don't match. Explain yourself. Why don't they match? They should match. So that's, I would say that's, those are the two big areas where I think, ReversingLabs can significantly help in pillar one and in pillar four, and specifically in the ability to analyze software and help organizations meet their requirements, including around continuous monitoring, for example. That's something else that ReversingLabs can help with, whether it's, again, for open source libraries that you're using, have a continuous monitoring of that, or whether it's for commercial software, knowing continuously if there's any new threats or any new risks to that software. That's something else where we can help.
Exactly. And as you mentioned, the element of assurance, verifying that this software bill of materials is correct. And the risk management, holistic risk management, I think that also points back to NIS2. So it's a consistency in those two, that it's not just about the technical controls and the vulnerabilities, but it is ultimately about the organization's accountability for managing cyber risks overall. And then just a bit sensitive of time, and we also want to mention the Cyber Resilience Act, which is then affecting manufacturers, importers, and distributors of the digital products. You see here sort of baseline cybersecurity requirements, driving requirements for cybersecurity controls, the software bill of materials, and so on, and also then enforcement related to penalties for non-compliance, ultimately then strengthening the trust and resilience in the supply chain. But in the interest of time, I think we'll or anything you would want to mention on the Cyber Resilience Act, Sasha, that we haven't covered?
The only thing that's, I think, important to highlight is the call for independent testing. There is ECRA or CRA, European CRA, calls for this concept of independent testing labs that can, independent of the vendor. And that's very, very important, right? It's in the US, it's the NTHSA for crash testing cars. I don't know what the equivalent body would be in Europe, but you wouldn't want the vendor, right, the car manufacturer telling you, and only them telling you, right, how their car performs in crash testing. You would want an independent body that's objective, that has, the right incentives to attest to that. And I think what ECRA is here is asking for, I think it's a very, very powerful mechanism, is that same sort of independence of testing and validation for the software that's purchased on the kind of territory of the European Union. What's actually interesting is that is being phased in. There's sort of tiers, which software needs it, which doesn't. As always, there's lots of nuance in how that is being implemented. But what's really interesting is only a handful of entities in Europe so far have been granted, the provisional authority to operate as these sort of independent testing labs. And what's interesting is a number of them have run into the same challenge that I think we have been kind of espousing for now 16 years in the industry, which is this is really hard to do manually. In fact, it's almost impossible to do manually. So, again, what are they going to do? If their tool set includes, the typical SAS, DAST, SCA, well, they've already lost. That's not what you get from the vendor. You get a compiled binary, you get a finished product. If they're going to manually pen test these, great. That's the defect discovery of an entire category of risks that are very, very important. But again, those are just vulnerabilities. They will not and cannot, it's just not the nature of pen testing, find things like the evidence of tampering of the CI/CD pipeline of the vendor themselves, right? Behavioral changes over time that are evidence of an attack like SolarWinds. That's the type of testing that, there's no way to scale with sort of human capital. And so what a few of them have now realized is that this is basically impossible to do with humans. And they've reached out to us from ReversingLabs and say, boy, could we figure out how to essentially use you guys behind the scenes as the engine to power this independent analysis. So for what it's worth, if folks in this call are interested in having their own version of an independent testing lab for software, many of them have reached out to us to see if we could be kind of what powers that capability.
Exactly. So enabling then the certification schemes, etc. We are really pushed on time. So I think some of the compliance challenges we've listed here, but this is, cost, resources, access to talent, and cybersecurity competency, technical limitations, rapidly developing technologies such as AI, quantum, crypto, and so on. So it's a large suite of challenges, of course, in implementing the regulations. So in terms of best practices, it really comes back to governance and active accountability, risk management that we discussed, the security controls and the technical controls put in place, including the tooling for software security, and continuous monitoring and reporting. And I know that these are sort of best practices that you have also worked a lot with, Sasha, on your side. Yeah, I think perhaps a place to sort of stop the discussion is to leave some of the technical solutions, and you could comment quickly on this, Sasha, before we take the questions in the Q&A.
Yeah, I think that the key is maybe to prioritize the Q&A is, for folks to know that for the first time, you can have a technical control around software supply chain. You don't have to rely on only kind of questionnaires and, sort of more soft types of controls. You can have a real control for software supply chain that includes real technical validation analysis, and not just of open source, but of the stuff that your company actually runs on, which includes commercial software as well.
Exactly. Thank you. Should we have a look at the Q&A together? So I'll leave this closing slide here. So I'll pick one. What is the difference between NIS2, and DORA? So NIS2 affects all sectors in Europe. It's very broad in that way. And it's two categories of entities. It's essential and important. So regulates a lot of businesses and organizations that have not been in scope of security regulations before. DORA is mainly affecting banking and finance, so it's more sector specific. So any of the Q&A that you want to point at, Sasha?
Yeah, there was a question earlier, maybe now it feels answered, around continuous monitoring of open source. For those who don't know, I would encourage you to take a look at a product from ReversingLabs called Spectra Assure. It is able to do exactly that. It's able to continuously analyze open source, but maybe more importantly, not just open source. So the same thing that can be done for open source, it can do for commercial packages as well. And again, I want to emphasize not just vulnerabilities. Yes, also vulnerabilities, but more importantly, other risks that could be even more, meaningful and impactful to, to the software.
Exactly. So, and I think that's what we have time for today, Sasha. So I'll leave some additional resources here. They're available in the resources section. And briefing package on NIS2 from us, White Label Consultancy, and of course the resources here, including on DORA and CRA from ReversingLabs. So with that, we have shared this information on the resources. Please reach out to us and ask any questions in the follow-up. And Sasha, thanks for a very interesting discussion on this super important topic. And I expect there will be a lot of attention on this going forward, both in Europe and the US.
Thank you. Thanks, Andre. Appreciate the opportunity, and very insightful as always from your side. Thank you.
Likewise, Sasha. Thank you.